Chapter 6 Experimental Research. Experimental research is the most rigorous of all research methods and is arguably the best method for testing cause and effect relationships. Yet, a review of the literature reveals that it is used in only 8% to 10% of LIS research studies. Some of the probably reasons why that is the situation will be explored during the course of this chapter. However, before discussing experimental research methods per se, causality, a concept which is crucial to experimental research, will be considered. Causality. Causality suggests that a single event, the cause, always lead to another single event, the effect. Yet, at least an understanding of causality is essential to the proper testing of causal hypotheses or relationships and is useful in designing research studies to be as rigorous as possible. The condition of causality, for example, if librarian instruction were a necessary condition of effective librarian use, then the latter would never occur unless library instruction had been provided. A condition may or may not be both necessary and sufficient for the occurrence of the phenomenon. If both, Y would never occur unless X had occurred, and whenever X occurred, Y would occur also. Basis for inferring causal relationship. One type of evidence for inferring a causal relationship is known as concomitant variation. Evidence of concomitant variation or covariation when there are two variables indicates that the independent variable X and the independent variable or assumed effect Y. Controlling the variables. If the subjects are not completely equivalent going into the experiment, the extraneous variables may be controlled statistically during the analysis stage. However, this approach is less reliable than others, as it is done ex post facto after the experiment. No amount of statistical control can completely undo the preceding effects of other factors, and it is effective at all only if the relevant extraneous variables are identified and properly measured. Random assignment. The third and best technique, two or more groups before the experimental treatment begins, is referred to as random assignment or randomizations, not to be confused with random sampling or selection. It is a procedure used after the sample is selected but before the experimental treatment is applied. Internal validity. Generally speaking, the greater the control experiment has over the experiment, including the extraneous variables, the greater the internal validity. The greater the control, however, the more artificial or unnatural is the setting and the lower an external validity. This relationship will be referred to again when discussing experimental designs. Threats to internal validity is crucial to the dependability of the results of an experiment, and it is closely related to replicability. Unfortunately, a number of factors can jeopardize the internal validity of experimental research. Those factors, most frequently cited in standard texts, are as follows. First, history of specific events. The researcher might then be uncertain about how much of the increase in library use was caused by the midterm exam and how by the library instruction provided. Second, maturation. During the course of the experiment, just referred to, the subject might naturally develop into more frequent library users regardless of any library instruction received. Testing, or the effects of taking a test upon the scores of a subsequent testing. In library instruction experiment, students would tend to do better on the second test of library skills simply because they had already taken the test. Instrumentation. For example, if a pretest on library use measured it as the number of titles borrowed, and the second measurement would probably be different simple because the method of the measurement had been changed. Statistical regression. This is especially significant where groups have been related on the basis of their extreme scores. If subjects in one group made extremely high score on a test of library skills, and subjects in a second group earned exceptionally low scores, the odds are that mean score on a retest. Again, this event would confound the effects of any library institution provided between tests. Biases in differential selection of subjects for the comparison groups. If a researcher selected students for the comparison group, the group not receiving any library instruction, who were not likely to evidence much meant in favor of the experimental treatment. Experimental mortality, or the differential loss of subjects from the comparison group. If during the course of an experiment, students would tend to be infrequent library users, perhaps because of their area of study, drop out of the comparison group, then the remaining members might produce scores higher than would be normal. Interaction of selection and other sources of invalidity. The results of the interaction can be mistaken for the effect of the experimental variable. For example, the students selected for the experimental group might have been exceptionally receptive to library instruction because they had matured intellectually during the experiment. External validity. The questions of external validity is never completely answerable. As is the case of internal validity, certain experimental design can help to maximize external validity. The major factors jeopardizing external validity or representativeness are as follows. The reactive or interactive effect of testing. This occurs when a pretest increases or decreases the subject's sensitivity or responsiveness to the experimental variable and thus makes the results unrepresentative of the general or unpretested population from which the subjects were selected. The interaction effects of selections, biases, and the experimental variable. This trait is similar to the sixth listed trait to internal validity. It simply means that one must be confused not all to select experimented subjects who are likely to be more receptive to the experimental variables than is the general population. The reactive effects of experimental arrange can prevent the researcher from being able to generalize about the effect of the experimental variable or persons exposed to it in non-experimental settings. Multiple treatment interference may occur whenever more than one experimental treatment is applied to the same subjects, basically because the effects of prior treatment do not entirely disappear. True experimental designs. As was indicated earlier, a variety of design can be employed for experimental research, and the stronger they are, the better they can minimize or control the variation traits to internal and external validity. True experimental designs. The pretest control group design, one of the classic true experimental designs, is usually referred to as the pretest post-test control group design as will be seen after a few examples. The standards name of basic designs tend to describe them rather well, but diagrams point out their major features even more clearly. The Solomon four-group design, a second standard true experimental design, is referred to as the Solomon 4 design. It is diagrammed as follows. This design scores the same in internal validity as does the previous post-test control group design because it controls all 8 traits. The post-test only control group design, the post-test only control group design diagrams the same as the last two groups of the Solomon 4-group design and appear as follows. This design is not used as frequently as it deserves to be, perhaps because of its lack of a pre-test, yet one can assume that the two groups are equivalent and the start of a study because of the random assignment, and a pre-test should not be necessary to confirm that assumption. Factorial design is the three preceding design are example of design capable of accommodating only one independent and one dependent variable. Factorial designs can deal with two or more independent variables and one dependent variables. Through experimental and correlation studies, the experiment have less external validity. However, that is true experiment are poor representation of natural situations. More specifically, they provide a relatively artificial test. The hypotheses tend to be low in generalizability and often produce relatively little descriptive data about the population unless the subjects are unusually representative. Difficulties to be avoided. In order to design an experiment that will be as reliable and valid as possible, the researcher should attempt to avoid the following: relying too heavily on a single experiment, using poorly designed or faulty data collection instruments, not identifying all of the variables that may affect the results, not choosing subjects that are as representative of the population as possible, introducing experimenter bias, introducing subject bias, making the subjects aware of the hypothesis being tested through unconscious signaling or behavior, and using an insufficient number of subjects. Evaluating the design and results of an experiment, there are several points that the researcher should consider. 1. The experimental should have the ability to test a null hypothesis, which suggests that there is no relationship between the variables being studied. 2. The experimental should be sensitive. Pre-experimental design. If a random assignment of subjects and laboratory-like control are not possible, it will be necessary for the researcher to use as pre-experimental or quasi-experimental design. Pre-experimental design which be considered first are those designs which not only lack random assignment but which have few observation points as well. A few examples of pre-experimental design follow. The one-shot case study. Regarding external validity, this design is unable to control for interaction between selection biases and the experimental variable for practical reasons. However, the one-shot case study is used fairly frequently. The one-group pre-test, post-test design represent a slight improvement over the one-shot case study because it incorporates a pre-test or one more observation point. It appears as follows. The static group comparison. Since the researcher was unable to create two equivalent groups, there is no assurance that the two groups had experienced the same amount of the experimental variables, or that the experimental treatment actually produced the differences, if any, in the final group scores.